Okay, what it means to be American, how the forced removal of Southeast Indians turned native lands into slave plantations. Okay, Christina Snyder. This says the Old South wasn't really that old. Plantations appeared in many areas of the Deep South only for a few decades before the Civil War. The South was Indian country. South's long and rich indigenous history is unknown to many Americans, and once you take a look, the signs are everywhere. In native places, Alabama, Arkansas, Chattahoochee, Tallahassee, Tennessee, and hundreds of earthen mounds half destroyed, and some still towering in native communities that remain in and near their homelands. Native peoples in their past have been marginalized. The southern history of the Indian removal and Andrew Jackson's presidency sought to erase southern Indians from the land and their historical memory. Uncovering the history of southern Indians reveals that the Old South was more than the Confederacy in the Lost Cause mythology. The European invasion and even into the colonial period, the South had the highest native population density north of Mexico, and long before secessionists tried to distinguish themselves from other Americans, native peoples of the South recognized cultural commonalities and distinguished themselves from Iroquois rivals to the north by calling themselves Southern nations. Southern native women who managed agriculture developed specialized regional varieties of corn thanks to the region's subtropical climate. They produce 2 crops per year. Women's leading role in farming is probably related to the region's matrilineal kinship system. Within the family's records, descent through the mother and past property and titles through the matrilineal. In time, the region's large population, agriculture, productivity, and booming trade networks gave rise to chiefdoms, nations, and even cities. The largest city was Cahokia, just east of modern-day St. Louis, which was bigger than London when it boomed around 1050 AD. Cahokia boasted around 20,000 residents in town and another 20,000 in surrounding areas. It took centuries of North American colonialism for European settlers to surpass it when Philadelphia did so in the 1760s. Although Americans associated Trail of Tears exclusively with the Cherokee Nation, Indian removal was a blanket policy aiming at removing all eastern Indians west of the Mississippi River. In total, 100,000 Indians were forced to leave. Most came from the South, where settlers coveted the rich lands, potential cotton fields still controlled by large Indian nations. So they're telling you right there that cotton fields was something, it was a crop that was already grown by the Indians before the Europeans even got to the Americas, okay? This was our crop. This was our industry, okay? And it says there had been removals before, beginning in the 17th century. Colonists forced some Indian nations onto small reservations after devastating wars. It says after the Revolution, the United States aggressively sought Indian land through warfare and treaties. The Indian Removal Act passed 1830. It says Congress and the President used the power of the federal government to undertake removal on a massive scale. Despite objections from many corners, the U.S. Supreme Court, Indian leaders, and activists, he pushed ahead. So, skipping down. It says, empowered by the middle income and poor white men eager to claim the spoils of Indian country. And it said that they use pseudoscience and other things to justify, doing this to the Indians. And then it said he had hired private contractors to remove the Indians. It says one contractor had received $20,000 bragged about to a colleague that he never issued a single ration, meaning food, to the Seminoles. And it says some women were forced to trade sex for food. Among the starving and poorly clad immigrants, disease ran rapid. Indian removal conceded the America's first cholera epidemic. Sometimes 40% of the camp died overnight. Smallpox, influenza, yellow fever struck as well. So these were diseases that they brought to our door, okay? It says the tears did not stop once immigrants reached Indian territory, roughly present-day Oklahoma, where famine, disease, and other extreme weather heightened mortality. Okay, so I'm going to skip down where they say, maddened by what was called Alabama fever, whites swarmed into newly seeded Indian land. Many even jumped the gun and planted cotton. Initially, most settlers lived in modest cabins or confiscated Indian homes. So in other words, so after the Indians were forced out, these whites took over those houses. So that tells you right there that the Indians, they wasn't just building, we weren't just building teepees. We had houses that was built out of logs and also made out of brick. And they know this because when you look at the pyramids, you had to be a master mason. You had to be a master builder in order to build a pyramid. Okay, so and say they built big houses, but you had to think, how did these Caucasians build these houses? They had to use our people in order to do them because they didn't know anything about, building, huge buildings and things like that. And these buildings, a lot of the buildings that you see here were built by the Indians. So anyways, it's acquired more land and pushed small landowners to economic margins. It says, and their ferocious demand for slave labor led to a massive population shift. African Americans were forced from the eastern seaboard and upper south into notoriously harsh slavery, expanding the cotton frontier. The plantation economy of the South grew so vast and powerful that it obscured most everything that came before it. Okay, so basically they letting you know the history. Okay, that that the Indians had cotton and they was growing cotton, and then the federal government under the direction of President Jackson, Andrew Jackson, that he went and took the land from the Indians, regardless of what the Indian leaders had to say, regardless of what the U.S. Supreme Court had to say, and he went and pushed propaganda to basically say that our ancestors were heathens and that we were savages and all that other type of lies and rhetoric.
Were on the lands that were in relation to the Pamunkeys and the Mattaponi. They were across the water, but they were still like our cousins. And we also did marry, it's the same example I gave you of King Devon's wife being from Chief Powhatan's family. Our tribe's lands were taken away in abundance, despite the fact that we did so much to help. And it was said that we were more Negro and we had mixed with African. Well, not at that time did they say Africans, but they said we were more Negro than Indian. The misnomer here being the fact that Indians were always Negro in appearance. We always were said to have different textured hair, curly, dark skin, and the fact that Negras or Negroes were not even transported to Virginia in large numbers at all, not during the entire 400 years of slave trade and servitude. There weren't very many. As a matter of fact, everyone knows about the 16, 19, 20 Negras. Really, it was said Negras, which meant they were females, which meant they were probably good for farming because in our culture, the women did the farming, the men did the hunting. So they also had Spanish names in it.
Okay, so this is from her video. I'm going to read this. I paused her video. And it says 1619, only 20 negras, slaves, and like she had stated before, negras was a term that they used for American Indian women. And it says, were the first slaves to arrive in Virginia. It said the total number of slaves sent to North America were insignificant compared to South America and the rest of the world. It says, according to A.J. SIPA, Black History Month, Living by Ernie Sudge, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, when discussing slavery in America, it's important to look at the numbers. Some experts estimate that there was a slave trade to the New World. More than 12.5 million people were stolen from Africa between 1525 and 1866, which we know that's not true. It says, in those who traveled the treacherous journey, only 10.7 million survived the Middle Passage. But most captives were shipped directly to the Caribbean and South America, including 4.8 to Brazil. And then, according to the Transatlantic Slave Trade database, so what they're claiming is that about 10 million Africans were brought over to the Americas, and that nearly half of those people, of those enslaved Africans, got brought over to the land of Brazil. And And also, but it says, but amazingly, it says only 388,000 was shipped directly to North America. So we know North America, that's the United States in particular, and probably Canada as well. It says now it is said that less than 350,000 African slaves of 10,700,000 African slaves were shipped to North America. Why so few for such a large continent? Why was the slave trade exaggerated? Why? Because they never wanted us not to know that America is our country. The African Americans are truly indigenous Americans. It says here the 350,000 total slaves divided 400 years of slavery is 875 slaves per year for the entire North American continent. Let's divide 875 among the 13 colonies, which results in 67 slaves per colony each year. That is nothing. Not enough to create a plantation economy on a continent of this size. Not enough to dominate the genetics of the indigenous Afro-Indian slaves. So now I'm going to let her continue what she was saying.
I mean, they weren't from Africa. So the fact that today they say they were from Africa is a blatant lie. And if you look in the old historic books, of which I have several, you will see that they were not African. Never was that word used. As a matter of fact, in the slave trade, they didn't use African. They would say specifically where they were from, just like people who are from the continent do today. They say, I'm from Nigeria, or I'm from, Liberia. They don't say, I'm from Africa. They would say, we got the slave from the Congo. We got the slave from Angola. They would say exactly where they got the slave from. If you look in old documents, that African terminology was very rarely used. And so, that being the case, and the fact that basically the slave trade, as they said, was not as much as what they had tried to make us believe, that only less than 250 some slaves were actually transported to North America for the whole entire period of servitude. That would mean that only in some places, in some colonies, only 80 some slaves came for the 400 years of slavery. That's crazy. 80 slaves, that's like a couple of classrooms of kids. Think about that. Anyway, the Powhatan chiefdom disappeared. That's the other thing. All these different tribes, there were many tribes. Even within the Accomacs, there were sub-tribes. Well, the Powhatan chiefdom, if you go from 1607, when the settlers or Anglo immigrants first arrived, it disappeared. All these different tribes just boop, 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 came off the map from the 20-year period, okay? Yet, miraculously, the Negro population grew by hundreds and hundreds of thousands. How do you account for this sudden increase of Negroes, and no accounting for the disappearance of the Indians? I mean, quite frankly, if the Indians were all disappeared from sickness, they would have been gone pretty immediately. It doesn't take long. Being a RN for 30 some years, I can tell you that if you're gonna die and you die of the horrible things that they died from, it wasn't like a long process. They died pretty quick. That would have been an initial thing, and then immunity would have been built up. People would have been okay. Wouldn't have been an issue. Blah blah blah. So the fact that you have all these Indians gone and all these Negroes all suddenly appearing, and the fact that the original people that explored the Americas, North America specifically, Virginia specifically, said that our people were chestnut brown to tawny. Did not mention our hair being straight at all. Mentioned our eyes being jet black. Mentioned our hair being mostly black, jet black or black. Why would you not think that there were already Negro people there? Why would you not believe that the indigenous people of Virginia were Negro in appearance? Everything that is written says we were, and we were. Let me also talk about the fact that we had many bands just in the Eastern Shore. A lot of people equate the survivors or descendants of the Accomacs with this reservation that was made. This good old reservation was only 1,500 acres. And I know that sounds like a lot to people, but let me put it in perspective. Ensign Savage was a immigrant that was given to the Accomacs as a guide or a interpreter or someone to learn the culture. This young man was said to be given 500 to 500,000 acres as a gift from the king. Now, of course, the idea of giving land and someone owning land in totality was not a custom or a law of the people that were Accomac. We did not give away land. People did not own land. So this is a false statement and a false transaction. Okay, but I won't get into that. However, the reality is that's the thing. One man given 5,000 acres as opposed to a whole nation or a whole tribe being given 1,500 acres. Let's be real. Our own major king, Devi Devan, did not coincide with the chiefdom. So his sub-tribes, they were probably the same way, like-minded, independent thinkers, people that kind of made their own decision for their sub-tribe or their clan. The fact that this reservation was started did not mean that everybody just trekked to the reservation. No, we had several bands. As a matter of fact, I have books that actually outline many of those names and their chiefs' names. The Magathas, the Nasawatuks, the Matawamis band or sub-tribe. There were multiple clans within each band or sub-tribe too. Our different bands and clans are supported by many different documentation. There were many sub-tribes, many bands. As far as the most important text that I refer to is Ye Kingdom of Accomac. That was written in the 1811, but actually refers back to the early 1700s, 1600s. And there were other branches, many branches, but the ones that I stuck out in my mind were the ones that relate to my family, mainly the Magathas. Also, there were Matawamis, there were Nasawatuks. The Nasawatuks were at but Elliot's Neck under King Tepeanpon. And then we had the Matawanos who were at Hunger's Neck, and they had their own king as well that was mentioned. So these would be our relatives that were right there on the eastern shore in their own little nest, in their own little communities, okay? Please believe everybody in their individual sub-tribes and bands did not necessarily join a reservation. That was probably started because it was a prison camp. I mean, the start of the reservation was actually coincides with the end of that major war that ended in 1632. Then you get a reservation in 1640. Hello, it was probably a slave imprisonment camp, which they took the prisoners of war and turned them into slaves, or got them together, divvied them out to people by auction or whatever, and that's most likely how that reservation started. Later, it was converted to lots that were allotted to people to say, get off of this good land and come over here and live now. And, that existed, that reservation, from 1640 until 1813 when they were pretty much disbanded and the Virginia Assembly removed our reservation. This was because there was a lot of pressure from the locals for land. They wanted the land, and so they got it.
Record a part of Indian Slavery and Unspoken History by Brown University, which is another Ivy League school that has a lot of our information about Indians being enslaved and about the Indian Wars and so on and so. And it says the purpose turns to an examination of Indian slavery under the title Indian Slavery in the Americas, Its Origins, Its Impact, and Implications. Okay, so let's get into this.
Natural histories, in other words, the colonial archive that I spend a lot of time looking at. So you get very old histories of the first European natural historian who goes to Barbados or to Jamaica or to Brazil or to Haiti. A lot of these are actually held in here, original copies, in the John Carter Brown Library. I want to spend a moment on this one, which is from Brazil. This is actually the first natural history of Brazil. You can see the European imagination working and how they see the Native Americans, or the Tupi-Namba people, as they call themselves, in Brazil. And the interesting thing about this old first natural history of Brazil for me is that I'm always thinking about the knowledge of plants, so the knowledge that enslaved Africans, and in this case in Brazil, the enslaved Tupi-Namba, because everywhere in Latin America, it's first the Native Americans who were enslaved, and then when that doesn't work in some kind of way, Africans are brought in. So the reason why this book is important, done by Willem Piso and George Margraaf, is that it was done in the time when the Dutch briefly held Brazil. Now we know Brazil is a Portuguese colony, but in the 1640s, the Dutch were holding Brazil, and the governor, Count Moritz of Nassau, thought it important to do scientific studies. So he brings over Willem Piso to look at questions of plants and the knowledge about plants. And in this time, we remember that the knowledge about plants is like knowing where gold and diamonds and oil are later on in history. So Piso does this book. And what do you find when you see the book is that the Tupi-Namba and the enslaved Africans are there on these early sugar plantations at the same time, and they're exchanging knowledge with each other. Most of the book is about what he calls the simples, which are the medicinal plants, the herbal medicines of the Tupi-Namba. But occasionally you find a page like this one that's shown there, where he reports that the Africans are teaching the Indians how, or the indigenous people, how to use particular plants. And so you begin to get a notion of the plants that the Africans managed to bring over, or that were brought over in the slave ship, like sesame, eggplant, and okra. And you also get a sense of how the Tupi-Namba are teaching the enslaved Africans about some very important plants, usually maize, but also cassava, which is the bread of the Caribbean. It's the bread of the Tainos, it's the bread of the Brazilians. The terms that were being used by the Portuguese and the Dutch at this time were also interesting. They called the Tupi-Namba in the beginning, when they enslaved them, negros da terra, the blacks of this land. And the ones who were coming in from Guinea and from Angola, and that's the first set, they are negros de Guinea and negros de Angola.